Hey everyone. I see we have quite a few attendees. We'll wait for more people to join and then we'll kick this off in the coming minutes. Looks like the numbers have stabilized a bit. So I will kick off our event. So today we're going to be talking about capitalism, laws, and the need for trustworthy institutions. Our guest today is Dr. Admati. She is the George G.C. Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business, Faculty Director of Corporations and Society Initiative, and a Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. She is also a faculty affiliate on the Center of Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law at Stanford. Professor Admati has written extensively on the information dissemination in financial markets, portfolio management, financial contracting, corporate governance, banking, and political economy. Since 2010, she has been active in the policy debate on financial regulations and on the challenge of creating trustworthy systems and institutions. Her current research, teaching, and advocacy focus on the complex interactions between business, law, and policy, emphasizing the importance of governance and accountability mechanisms. Professor Admati has testified before legislatures and engages extensively with policymakers, scholars, and in various fields and the media. She is a fellow of the Econometric Society, a recipient of multiple fellowships, research grants, and paper awards, and a former board member of the American Finance Association, the FDIC's Systemic Resolution Advisory Committee, and the CFTC's Market Risk Advisory Committee. Dr. Admati is the co-author with Martin Hellwig of the award-winning book, The Banker's New Clothes: What's Wrong with Banking and What to Do About It. In 2014, she was named by Time magazine as one of the most 100 influential people in the world, and by Foreign Policy magazine as among 100 global thinkers. With a broad education mission, Dr. Admati has developed multiple new interdisciplinary courses and organized conferences and events to draw on many disciplines on the social sciences and the law. Dr. Admati holds a Bachelor's of Science from Hebrew University, an MA, Master's of Philosophy, and PhD from Yale, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Zurich. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Admati.
Thank you, Kevin, and I'm very happy to be with you virtually. I wish I was there in person with at least some of you, but we have learned about the possibilities. I'm going to share some slides, and the title of the talk is that paper with this title, which you can find easily, and it has a bunch of words and no figures and no visuals. But my talk is going to have a lot of visuals, which I'm going to fly through at large speed. So the first word in the essay title is motivated by a question I was asked, and a few other people were asked by Oxford Economic Policy Journal, a review of economic policy, which is what has gone wrong with capitalism and how to fix it in 5,000 words. So that's quite a challenge. And so what I thought I'd do is start with the meaning of those words. So if you listen to the politics, you're going to hear that choice. You're a capitalist or you're a socialist. And socialist, obviously, in this country is a very nasty word by some, but, some have embraced, socialism. But what is it all about? I will claim it's a false debate, a false choice, and a very muddled debate. You also hear the champions of markets, free market, contrasting it as if we have to choose between markets and government. And I'm going to try to put a framework around all of that. So let's start with the fact that in the dictionary, communism, socialism, capitalism, and then democracy, which will come into play in my talk as well, are all top searched words, and they're very confusing to people. They're very abstract. They don't understand the connection between them. And that's for a good reason, because the way they're being used is very confusing. So here's the definition as a dictionary gives it, as the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and there are other definitions. A way of organizing. Capitalism is a way of organizing the economy. So the things that are used to make and transport products, land, oil, factories, ships, are owned by individuals, individual people and companies rather than the government. And then the socialism is just the opposite of that. So it presents it as, capitalism is not socialism, socialism is not capitalism, because socialism is a way of organizing society in which the major industries are owned and controlled by government rather than by individual people. So keywords in both is owned and controlled. And so somehow people come to own, or the government comes to own, and that's the way it's being discussed. The question is, how do people, companies, or you might say the government, but the government somehow has the power to seize, come to own things? So you think you own something, you own a piece of property, you put a fence around it, and then if somebody comes in, you want to call somebody, you want to say this is mine, or you want to sell it because it's yours, or you sign a contract with somebody. Well, how does all of that work? What's the infrastructure of all these things that people talk about? Capitalism. Switching gears completely, because of the war especially, and I did start a class this year at Stanford with this thing that's not discussed much in business schools where I am, human rights. The UN in 1948 had this declaration. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of this committee, and it has 30 articles that say that humans have rights. And the question is, who will protect those rights? So it's very nice to say everybody has a right to political expression and health and education and freedom from slavery and all of that. Is it going to be national government? Is it going to be international bodies? Is it going to be people and businesses? We have a war right now. People say there's war crimes. Well, what happens then? So this false choice between market and government, some people say, I want this, and other people say that, is completely wrong-headed, because you can't have markets and corporations, companies, without a legal infrastructure. And the question is, who writes the rules of the game for people, for institutions, corporations, for markets? How do the markets actually work? Okay. And then when we write a contract, there's got to be some enforcement behind it. Otherwise, it's just a word on an ice, or we just might as well just have a world of naked power. So the competence and integrity of governments, which are sort of the source originally of a lot of power and infrastructure in the economy and legal systems, matter greatly to this entire discussion, but they're often not mentioned at all. It's you choose one or the other in terms of who owns and who controls. So institutions are critical. You got institutions that are sovereign governments. You got multinational corporations. All of them are institutions. And once you have institutions, governance is key. What do I mean by governance? Here's a framework. Who makes decisions for the institutions? Acts on the institution's behalf? What information do they have? What constraints do they face? What should be their information and constraint? And what are their motivations, incentives? What makes them do something? Are they doing it for themselves? Are they doing it for other people? And then the big question is, how's it all working out? Is the governance working for us of that institution, whatever institution it is? So the big words around governance, which are words, very simple words in the English language: power, information, incentives, all of these are about governance ultimately. And if you're going to have good governance, you should have trust. You should have a way to commit, not to harm. And you should have accountability when you harm. And the question is how to get those things to work. Especially, can you make governance work in the dark? And how do you trust anybody? Who can you trust? What makes people and institution worthy of trust is the question. Trustworthy. So here they're passing something behind their hands and we may not see it. This is seen from the backs. And this actually is a picture in my tab of advocacy in my personal website. So let's talk about corporations. And let's talk about their governance. Okay, a corporation is an institution in the private sector. The history of corporations is interesting. They started in the current form in the 17th, 18th century. You have famous institutions like the Dutch East India, the English East India that controlled actually India and vast amounts, and they were like government. They had armies and all of that. In the end of the 19th century in the US, you had corporations that did infrastructure. They needed a special permission from Congress to even incorporate. And today, incorporation is very easy. You can incorporate for any reason. We have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of corporations at any jurisdiction, millions of them around the world. In fact, Delaware being the capital of incorporations, but other states want it because in the US it is a state thing. Could have a 285,000 corporations with one address because it's so easy to incorporate. It's easier than getting a library card. You don't even need to identify yourself by a person. You send somebody to start a corporation for you for almost nothing. So the key features of corporations are that they are abstract legal entity. They are created by the law. You do not have a company like Apple, like Google, like all the household companies that you have heard about without a legal framework, without incorporating in a jurisdiction, in a state, and then operating in other places. They are separate from all humans. So they exist in a legal sphere separately from all of us. So they'll say, company X did this, said this, etc. Who is that? They're created under state law in the US, often Delaware law. They're governed by law and they can create their own charters and promise to do certain things. So their existence and rights derive from governments and legal systems. What they can do, property rights, they can own things, they can sign contracts, they actually own the shareholders' funds and other funds that people gave them. Either they have to return it by contract, or pay by contract, or they have shareholder funds, which, some investor protection rule protect, or governance rules of the corporation about boards and dividends and all that. They have limited liability, meaning that if they owe something, then it can only be paid from the assets of the company and not from the assets of anybody involved in the company. And in this country, they even get political speech rights and religious rights. So first of all, there's a veil. That's the separateness that separates corporations and their stakeholders from each other's obligations. And here you see the veil and you see the corporation, which I just drew as a bunch of buildings, but anyway, it's abstract, and people being everybody who interacts with it or who just is impacted by it. In terms of civil rights in this country, corporations had sort of their own March of Washington, but it's really happened in the courts. Corporate right movement has remained unnoticed, said this book called We the Corporations, long before controversial decisions you may have heard of. Citizen United was a decision that allowed corporations to spend a lot of money on politics through the First Amendment of speech rights, and Hobby Lobby, which gave a corporation religious rights based on the religious beliefs of its owners as it comes to a healthcare bill. Corporations have taken place among we the people, which is the first words of the Constitution of the United States. In other words, they get civil rights that the framers intended for human people. When it comes to what corporations do, they're often guided in a business school like where I am by effectively what Milton Friedman wrote in a famous 1970 article that implored managers in corporations to just make as much money as possible, which is measured by, stock price or some accounting profits or some return measures, while conforming to the basic rules of society, he qualified, both those embodied in the law and those embodied in ethical customs. So this cartoon says, well, the way they act, claiming that they're doing everything for their shareholders, can destroy the planet. The planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment of time, with a smoking city in the back, we create a lot of value for our shareholders. And more recently, there have been all these calls for, stakeholder capitalism and better capitalism and all of that. And the CEOs of 181 companies, some of their faces you might recognize, said they're committed to everyone, to customers and employees and suppliers and communities and shareholders too, for the future success of our companies, our communities, and our countries. Okay, that's what they said. Davos is a place in Switzerland where elites, business leaders and government leaders get together in January, usually in person, but not in COVID. And they had a manifesto in 2020, just before COVID, the universal purpose of a company in the fourth industrial resolution, where the key was the purpose of the company is to engage all its stakeholders in shared and sustained value creation. Nice words. Talk is very cheap. So just for example, one of the main speakers of how stakeholders matter is the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, and he sends a letter to companies that they own. They are a huge asset manager with trillions and trillions of dollars of pension money and other investor money, savings of people. They recently had a person named Tariq Fancy resign, who used to do their sustainable investing. People talk about ESG investing and impact investing and all of that, or creating some kind of impact on companies. The person said it was a placebo. It diverts our attention to what needs to happen. And of course, down on the ground, despite all what the CEO is saying, they want to deal with states that have a lot of fossil fuel, and that they say, don't worry about Larry Fink and what he said. So that's just from recent. So the question is, how important is deception in general? This little visual said, trust me in the front, but behind it, it has a couple layers which say I'm lying. Now, I mean, I could be lying to myself as well. So when people deceive, there's sort of self-deception as well that goes on. And, in propaganda wars, you see that. So one of the ways in which we can try to build trust is by having good rules of the game. I trust you. I get on the road and trust that people won't drive too recklessly because we do have traffic laws. So some rules are written by government, and there are some words associated with them: laws, regulations, acts, guidelines, directives, executive orders, or treaties between countries. And some rules are written in the private sector. When we go on Facebook, it's Mark Zuckerberg effectively that writes the community standards and they decide what we can post and not post on Facebook, on Twitter, or anything like that. So the private sector writes these statements or charters or codes of conduct that we have to abide by if we want to engage with them. They can insist on it. But all rules, even constitutions that are kind of the biggest commitment we can make as a society, are hard to change, need somebody to write them, but also once they're there, somebody to decide if you broke it and what would happen to you if you do. So how do you make people comply with rules? Well, you put the policeman on the street and they have a radar and they'll stop you if you drive above the speed limit. So in the political discourse, there are certain words that trigger people. People tend to say we need laws. It's a rule of law. It's a rule-based system, whatever. But if you say the word regulation, especially around a business school, oh, that's terrible. That would harm innovation. Terrible things will happen and all of that. Again, that is, you saw that in my previous slides, laws and regulations were just all rules created by government. So for any rule, if you want to judge whether it's a good rule or not, you first of all, if you say costly to whom? It's costly to me that I have to take a taxi instead of driving while under the influence. But we decided it's costly for me that I can't rob you. It's costly. I wish I could just reach into your pocket and take your money. But we decided that's not okay to rob people or to drive recklessly. So the question is, what is the social cost and benefits, not the private cost and benefit of a given rule? If you have to comply with the rule, that might not be as convenient as not having the rule and having the freedom to do whatever you want. So the question is then, how well is the rule, the letter of the law, the football rules or the basketball rule or any rule for that matter? The devil is in the detail. So it's often in the small print of exactly how it's done. And then we can get to debate that. And without enforcement, rules are useless. Sometimes people say, oh, I innovated, and the innovation is just to get around the rule. This cartoon says these new rules will fundamentally change the way we get around them. So the referee is here holding a red card in a soccer game, and here is the player, kind of lobbying or asking, what did I just do? And arguing with that. Obviously, beyond formal rules, we have informal rules, we have social norms that guide our decisions, we have ethical norms that may affect what we do. And then the question is, who do you care about? As there is a war right now, that question is being asked. Do you care about yourself and your family? What kind of community? Do you care about your nation, country? And at what cost do you care about the whole world? So now you go back to Milton Friedman, and you want to unpack what he said, make as much money while obeying the rule of society. That would be all great and fine. And we would teach you in a business school how to make as much money as possible. If all the shareholders agree, all they want is, maximize stock price, and that's how you measure maybe shareholder value or what corporations should be doing. Milton Friedman assumed that the markets are a free and competitive market. Well, how does that quite happen? That there is no deception and fraud. He said this specifically. That means, maximize profit in a free and competitive market without deception and fraud, later in the article. And these rules of society that he wants you to obey protect people. Between the ethical rules and the legal rules and the way they are enforced, all the others that are interacting with the firm, employees, customers, creditors, and the public are protected by their contracts, by the markets, by the law. But what if that's not true? What if shareholders also are people and they care about something else? And so we see now, people pushing corporations to opine on laws or political debates about voting rights or other things. What, importantly, about government failure? What if the government doesn't write good rules when it's their turn to write rules, when they need to write rules for everybody? What if corporations can get involved in writing the rules and they tell their policymakers how to write them? And what if corporations are able to cause a lot of harm with impunity? What happens then? Then the whole Milton Friedman thing doesn't work. And the question becomes, do corporations in the real world actually obey the rules of society in the law and in the ethical customs? Do the contracts, law, and ethics protect stakeholders properly? Do they even protect shareholders? So, whoever acts on behalf of the corporations. I mentioned money laundering only because it is often happening through the corporate form. And money laundering just means that money from criminal activity or from kleptocratic regimes, where the regime leader steals money from the public in their nation, can somehow enter the legitimate system. And that could happen through corporations, through real estate, through art, through other things. So now that we're looking for oligarchs and wanting sanctions, we confront the fact that we have enabled all of that. So, for example, we have a financial crimes enforcement network that is called FinCEN, and all our banks are kind of supposed to check the sources of big money, but they just take fees and they might report a suspicious activity and then they move on. And that Department in Treasury is just drowning in trillions of dollars of suspicious activities and nothing happens. Now, I'll just flash a few examples that you may have heard of. You may have heard of the company Purdue and of the opioid crisis, a very tragic crisis in this country that started with Purdue Pharma marketing OxyContin and continued through many enablers that are other opioids manufacturers, distributors, pharmacies, regulators, nonprofits, and lawyers that enabled the Purdue and the owners of Purdue to perpetuate the use of opioids in medicine and the deception that happened about whether it's addictive or not. That has led to opioid crisis, now fentanyl and other deaths and addiction in the many, many hundreds of thousands, if not more. My local company that's a bit of a menace is our utility company here, PG&E, involved in many fires and where some people also died. So that's our current menace. We had people dying from Boeing, cutting the corners. We had banks that paid billions and billions of fine, but make a lot of money. So it's the cost of doing business. And I'll recommend a bunch of books along the way. This is a book by a very, very insightful judge called Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free. And this is about the basic justice system. We incarcerate a lot of people, even innocent people, for minor offenses, and they often cannot defend themselves in the courts or with plea bargains. But business executives seem to be exempt from criminal prosecution. And he implores judges to speak up about that. Otherwise, how can we be instruments of justice? So this is a cartoon about crime and punishment in the corporate sector. It refers to Wells Fargo, another one of the local companies. Turning to democracy. Democracy is about how we organize the government for the people, of the people, by the people. So if you kind of take the same veil of legal and political shields, you put the government and then you put the people of the nation or of the constituents of that government and of others around it that might be impacted. How do we get the government to serve society, or governments, plural, to serve society? James Madison, in trying to talk about democracy and the Federalists and the Constitution, said, if men were angels, he only mentioned men, so maybe women are angels. I don't know about that, but he did say it that way. No government would be necessary. Of course, women were not participants in democracy at the time, in the beginning. The great difficulty lies in this, and now he said, you must first enable the government to control the governed, so you have to give the government sort of power. And in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So the Constitution was constraining the government so that, the government can't, seize your assets or do things. So we have Constitution that protects people from the government, okay? This is a paraphrase of this question about corporations. Corporations are created and governed by law. This is my formulation. The great difficulty lies in this. We must first give, not giving, the corporations appropriate legal rights. And in the next place, we must ensure that corporations do not control the law. And they probably didn't think of corporations. They just kept thinking of people and the government. So how do people govern in a democracy? Where the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government, said Thomas Jefferson. This was in the creation of the University of Virginia. So effective democracy requires that people are committed and informed to democracy. They want to have informed debate. They want to compromise so that we make decisions democratically. And you need institutions, a set of interlocking institutions, representative bodies, media, decision-making mechanisms. But what if powerful people do not really believe in democratic values? Now you have a little bit of a problem. You need the institution to somehow make sure that democracy survives. And we have a crisis about that. So what's really most troubling about democracy crisis is also the fact that we can't agree on facts, and we have a lot of polarization and people believing things that might not be true. But back to the sort of theme of the combined crisis in democracy and capitalism, we have a lot of anger about, system being rigged or whatever, but we don't fully understand the sources of the problem, which often are about governance. So I'll utter that word that is very rarely uttered. And when it's uttered in this country, it's often uttered in the context of, other regimes in some other countries, as opposed to ever in our country. The word being corruption. What is corruption? It's essentially the abuse of power for private gain, or the abuse of entrusted power by people who are supposed to be trusting, but they betray this trust, whether they have power in the private sector or in the government. And I will put here a nearby definition that includes the word capitalism called crony capitalism, a system that is essentially a corrupted form of capitalism. with oligarchs, with people with power, basically not being trustworthy. There are a few books that claim that the United States has a corruption problem. This book by an expert in corruption around the globe, Sarah Chase, is called On Corruption in America and What's at Stake. It came out during COVID, August 2020. And she is talking about corrupt networks. And in a conversation with her, she claimed to me that the US citizens are just not ready to confront our own corruption, but she's worried about it. A few millionaires are worried about the system. This is a book called Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Ever Richer, written by a group called Patriotic Millionaires. And they are rich people that feel something's wrong with the system. The vast majority of Americans believe the economy is rigged in favor of the rich, and they're right. How do you rig a system? You start with a tax code. So a tax code that's very complicated with lots of loopholes, that doesn't collect taxes properly, all of that. Another book on the US corruption just came out a few months ago called American Kleptocracy. For years, one country has acted as the greatest offshore haven in the world, attracting hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit finance tied directly to corrupt regimes, extremist networks, and the worst the world has to offer. Country providing the most also happens, profiting the most, also happens to be the one that still claims to be leading the fight against the crooked and the corrupt, the United States of America. So if we talk about corruption, we start by looking at the mirror, and then definitely there are people more corrupt than us, and we should certainly go after them. And if they violate human rights, we definitely want to do that. But there's tough competition for corruption from across the Atlantic Ocean in the UK. This is a very recent book, just appeared last month, called Butler of the World, and there are a few others focusing on UK corruption. If somebody is rich, whether they're Chinese or Russian or whatever, and they need something done or something hidden or something bought, Britain sorts it all out for them. That's why they call London, Londongrad, and all the oligarchs are there. That's what Butler's does, Butler of the World. How Britain helps the world worst people launder money, commit crimes, and get away with everything. And there are some headlines you can find with some good visuals as well. Welcome to Britain, everything's for sale. If you think the UK isn't corrupt, you haven't looked hard enough. And when cronyism becomes corruption, really about the current government there. So how does the corruption happen? In a network and often out of sight. It takes sort of a village of enablers, many people who help the corrupt achieve their goals, public relations, lawyers, trade organizations, consultants, think tanks, and all the way to academics. So underground, there are all these people who know the details and all of that. Now, I am not saying this to depress you. What I want to say is, to wrap up, we don't have to choose between capitalism and socialism. We don't have to choose between markets and big government. We must work to create a system in which the economy can work, in which corporations can thrive and do what we created them to do, which is long-term innovation and employing people and all this stuff, without destroying the economy, without ruining democracy, and in which governments are actually empowered rather than overwhelmed and weakened, and they can enforce proper rules for all. I think education is key, starting at, and it's part of why I'm here, and great to speak to all of you and speak to people, especially young people, when I get the chance. So it's up to all of us, and this is from an essay that a shorter essay than the other one. And I want to just end by bringing up a ex-dean from many years ago, decades ago, of the Stanford Business School where I am, and somebody who came from the private sector who said something very insightful many years ago. R.J. Miller, this is a brief biography. He was a dean at Stanford from 1969 to 1979 of the Stanford Business School. And he spoke in 1968, December, so that's over 50 years ago, to a group of academic economists and financial economists. Let me urge academic people, he said, whatever their field of learning, to assume a larger role in helping to resolve the critical social problems of our nation face. This speech, linked right here, is a sort of best of time, worst of time. This was a period of social unrest. He came from Detroit, from car manufacturers, and saw the Detroit riots and saw Ralph Nader and the consumer fight for consumer rights and all of that. Universities should, of course, maintain their primary emphasis on teaching and research, but it does not mean that they cannot relate more effectively to the problems in the outside world. University has two advantages in this respect. First, it has the interdisciplinary talent and intellect to deal with complex problems. And second, university people can be more objective than either business or government people who are direct parties of interest in most problems. So he was saying institutions out there, of course, universities are institutions themselves. They are nonprofit institutions. And my own school is a sort of a nonprofit institution, and they live by money from their donors. So you always have to worry about governance of everybody, even in a nonprofit, but who can be really providing wisdom. That's sort of where the problem is. So I end by challenging you to consider what you can do. That's how I challenge myself. What would you change? What might you be able to do about it? And what would you do about it, and when, if not now? We need civic-minded leaders in society, and anybody can be a leader. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Admati. So I'll open it up for questions now through the QA feature. But before we even start, in your readings, you talk about the difference between financialized capitalism and shareholder capitalism. And I just kind of want to better understand that distinction, between the two.
Yeah, so people, my co-author on the book, Martin Hellwig, has an essay in the same volume where they asked a lot of people how to fix capitalism. And he focuses more on the control by managers. So he claims, and some people claim, that the sort of front that this is all about shareholders is really a rhetoric that hides the fact that it's all for the managers and the CEOs. So he speaks to executive compensation and other things. I don't use shareholder capitalism, but financialized capitalism, because of the way we got used, especially in the last few decades, to measure everything by financial metrics. A lot of them have to do with the stock market. So there is this notion of financialization of the economy, where we became very focused on financial market. And as a financial economist, of course, this was a period in the 80s where the financial system was supposed to somehow support growth and invent all kinds of new mechanisms to give credit to people and create derivatives and investment bankers and all of that. And I have come to think of the financial system. I didn't talk about it much now, but my big policy battles had to do with containing what I believe is the really inefficient, bloated, distorted, and reckless financial system. So what's wrong with banking and what to do about it is that banking is an example, and the financial sector, which I understand well because I used to teach finance for a long time, and I still teach financial literacy a lot, but I dropped a lot of the mathematical techniques which somebody else can teach to people who want to go work in finance, that the sector is not proper. The rules of the game for finance are badly designed, and they have led to the financial crisis. And even now in COVID, I would say, even though I don't write as much about it, the problem didn't obviously start with the banks, like the crisis of 2008, which to the young people I talk to now is ancient history because they were in elementary school or high school or very young, but which many older people really lived through, where the financial system came to near collapse, sort of like the Great Depression. The COVID crisis didn't start in finance, but the financial system remained a huge beneficiary of a lot of government support to people and stood to benefit from a lot of central bank, Fed, and other central banks supports. And government support, benefiting from huge windfall. So the system didn't collapse, but that's because everybody got benefited in this, and the banks, the financial sector benefited a lot. And so everybody in sort of when the dust is settled, the people in that sector did better than other people. And so it remained distorted and extractive of the rest of the economy, too big for what we need it to be. And of course, now we have new innovations and crypto and all of that, which is a whole other subject of conversation. But I believe that the financial system remains an unhealthy part of the economy, and that the fact that we are focusing all corporate governance, compensation to executives on financial metrics like stock price, and that's what people focus on as following the sort of make as much money as possible, is sort of where, combined with bad rules, is where the problems are. And I'm focusing on trying to get the rules right so that following the dictum of make as much money as possible or maximize stock price would be okay. In other words, the conditions, the assumptions that would make that objective okay are actually true in reality. Therefore, the rules would protect everybody, and then it wouldn't be such a big problem.
Awesome. I think, so a question from the audience on the lines of global governance. What is the role of the World Economic Forum in all of this?
World Economic Forum is a nonprofit organization sponsored by, funded by mostly by large corporations and wealthy people. And they claim to bring together people from government and from the private sector to kind of solve the problems of society. The problem, so I've gone to, I've watched what they do. I've participated in some of their activities. I've gone to their main event in Davos a couple of times. And it's a place of elites that oftentimes is a little bit detached from realities on the ground. You can have people in the World Economic Forum kind of seeing that people are angry, but not even fully understanding why. So they can get quite detached from the real world. So it's a well-meaning thing, but ultimately it doesn't want to talk about certain things that are inconvenient for the people who are there.
In a different vein, so we talk a lot about like the financial sector, and then there's a whole other sector that I think has a lot of attention right now, which is data collection.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on governance in that space?
Yeah. So I wanted to expand my horizons from all the problems in finance, where you can characterize the problems in finance as a sort of it's a sector that's very tied with the government all the time, is in a sort of symbiotic relationship through the central banks as well. Whereas the other sector, the tech sector, or just, digital technologies and all of that, obviously coming from Silicon Valley, it's all around me, was born, especially the internet, was born free of government, and in fact declared its own independence of governments. You sovereigns, get out of the way. We are the cyberspace, was sort of the declaration of independence of cyberspace. So you could say that finance is about money governance and coinage and investment and funding, whereas internet is about data governance. So it's about who controls data and what do they do with the data and the monetization of the data. And of course, it becomes, so the internet and that sector interfered with sectors that existed before: communication, media, and obviously commerce. So you got the Amazon in commerce, you got sort of search and then you got the media and social media, and there they sort of because we don't have a lot of it is invisible and a lot of it is complicated. We sort of got ourselves from an industry that claimed to free us and be helping democratize to another sort of power concentration in a few big tech companies. And so it raises a lot of questions about, privacy and surveillance and how to organize that that system. That as well, I believe that both sectors, the tech sector and the financial sector, actually have a fundamental problem with democracy. In other words, they have helped undermine democratic governments and are in sort of in a power struggle. I mean, the banking system is less in a struggle and more in a symbiosis. The tech system is now, both, because oftentimes what goes wrong with the democracies is that they get corrupted. I mean, you just get a certain money in politics relationships and other ways in which the people in the government gets confused. And the question is what informs them. So they get talked into doing things, persuaded. So I gave a talk last week and I titled it Corporations, Persuasion and the Rule of Law. So in the essay, that's the title of this talk, I also talk about all the ways of persuasion, from marketing to lobbying to persuading in courts. The world of persuasion captures a lot of different parts of the economy, and that shadow lobbying and all, shadow, takes a village. It's a war on the minds, on what we think.
So on a similar note, we actually have an awesome question from Wayne, who asks, many, including me, seem to work for the corruption influenced peddlers and enablers that work the Hill for projects and special interests needing budgets.
Yeah.
Could be for national security purposes and defense, or for nonprofits that seek budget for programs. What would you propose we do to change the way laws and regulations are formed? Is it term limits, campaign finance reform, or any other alternative?
Yeah, so I think campaign finance and some changes in voting systems can help a lot, with the polarization, with some, so it starts with money. So Larry Lessig wrote a bunch of years ago, Republic Lost, which was really about, he called it corruptive dependencies of our elected officials on money in politics, the amount of time they have to spend fundraising, all of that. And the fact that we're not paying, sometimes you have slightly less democratic societies or regimes, but they are very accountable, like in Singapore, and they tend to pay more to policymakers and technocrats and bureaucrats. They peg salaries in the public sector to the level of responsibility you have in the private sector. And we have corners of the government, of our government, where that is true, like the auditors, regulators, they get paid a lot. Suddenly, it's just weird anomalies. But some of our public servants are paid so little, so they have to go and revolve to the private sector and then use their connections in government. So I think that helps create these corruptive relationships. I think, the key for all of us is to really recognize we need a good system. There are so many great nonprofits around, and it's so easy even for nonprofits to get corrupted by sources of funding. So what's hard is to really remain committed to the social good. And there are a lot of good people. And I meet some of these people inside the private institution and the private for-profit institutions. Oftentimes, though, they don't speak up because their institution doesn't let them speak up. That's true also for public institutions. Everybody protects their institutions. So I think the first thing is to really kind of face up to our challenge, and because it is a big challenge, and we just do what we can do.
So again, on a similar vein, if the abuse of the public interest by private power is the risk posed by capitalism that is solved by government oversight, how is a regulatory state implemented by often lifetime tenured bureaucrats a solution? When elected representatives delegate to control experts? Where is the effective social control? And doesn't that explain some of the unrealized motivations to populism?
Okay, so I believe in democracy, and I believe in there being political accountability. And I have met a lot of really good people in government who are working for low salaries for the public good, elected officials as well. So so I think that if we want a democracy to work, we need to, try to know enough about policy and to try to shield policymakers from, to try to provide them kind of unconflicted information as much as possible, which is why I think academics should do more unconflicted. But of course, we are also humans, and a lot of academics can get corrupted themselves, and there have been many examples of that. So it's a very difficult thing to sort of find the right people. But when Milton Friedman rails against the iron fist of government bureaucrats, he expresses this very unfortunate disdain that many have towards the government. That Ronald Reagan said, government is not a solution for our problem, government is the problem. And that attitude is really a very unfortunate one, because we got to have good government. We really we need good government. Just like you want to have just the right police department when it comes to, immediate physical safety and justice. We need good government at all levels, including. So we want the system not to be rigged, and it has to start with government. I try to teach this in a business school, and it takes a little while for MBA students too, who are just thinking the government is just a burden on all their ideas and all of that, and is just have a negative view of government, to appreciate not only that we all need the government to work well, and definitely COVID has shown that, but that the government needs good people. And so, without that, it's just difficult to think that. So I instead of thinking, oh, the government fails, which I definitely have been screaming about myself, I think we have to both help the government and hold it to account at the same time. And that's a tall order we face, but it is the only way to have a good society.
So on a similar note, you write about regulatory capture. And I just want to know, what's the role of regulatory capture in all of this?
It's huge. A capture is basically a situation in which a regulator forgets who they're working for. And that can just sort of happen because that's the people they interact with are in the sector they're regulating, and they sort of start viewing them as customers, or they start thinking that they are kind of in some, hanging out together in conferences, or just kind of collaborating, and they just forget that they're working for the public and not for the same people they're trying to regulate. So it's a symbiosis that happens when they sort of all become detached from the public, that they somehow the interest of the narrow interests just rise, and it's just a problem. The public is just not there in the room. So what you have is what a colleague who actually is an accounting professor called thin political markets, that around the table when the rules are set, there are only the people who are really most affected by those rules or experts, and the experts are often conflicted with the public. So we just need more expertise coming that is remembering what it's all about. And that's why, there is hope that somehow academic institution, if they put their mind to it, might be able to help, but they have to see themselves as part of a system. So, but regulatory capture is just something to be aware of and fight and pay attention to and notice that it's happening. And, there are different, think about, so auditing, for example, and this is in the private sector. This is a private watchdog, KPMG, they sign on the audits. I mean, we had Enron 22 years ago or 20 years ago, we had a law that created regulation for the big four audit companies and other auditors. And, they start themselves signing off on fraudulent, disclosures. This happened in Germany with a company called Wirecard, happened in the UK. And all the countries wake up to the fact that, and investors, that you can't trust financial reports.
I think for our final question, just to close it out, there's a question that's asked, you've separated capitalism from socialism as an either or, but many are working together in most countries, including the USA. What's your perspective on this?
Oh, but I'm saying it's a false choice. I didn't present it. The dictionary presents it. The narrative presents it. I am saying it's not the choice. In this country, it's especially presented as a choice. Capitalism is the American way of life, and socialism is therefore a betrayal of American values or something. That's nonsense. I mean, it's BS. I mean, that's nonsense. It's not true. It really is sort of the wrong way to frame it. So the dictionary definition is very confusing, which is why people are confused. And I started with that only to say that this is the bad way to frame it.
So we're actually at time. Thank you so much, Dr. Admati, for this presentation, answering our questions. I think this is really valuable and a unique perspective. To the attendees, this lecture will actually be posted on our SMU Tower Center YouTube channel. So you can access it there as an upload. But thank you all for joining, and thank you, Dr. Admati.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.